The story you were told about World War II was not entirely wrong, but it was carefully incomplete. The version that survived the war, the one that filled classrooms and museum exhibits and documentary narrations for decades afterward, was a version that had been processed, reviewed, approved. The messy parts had been filed away, reclassified, quietly allowed to fade. What remained was a narrative with clean edges, a story of necessary sacrifice and ultimate justice, of good nations rising against evil ones, of a world that recognized its lowest point and chose to climb out of it. That story is not false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the parts that are missing do not simply complicate the picture, they change it. What actually happened between 1939 and 1945 was a war that functioned, in large part, like a machine. It had administrators and logistics officers and procurement specialists and legal advisors and communications departments. It had filing systems. It had forms. It had approval chains that moved decisions upward and orders downward with the same bureaucratic regularity that governed postal routes or tax collection. The killing was not chaos. The destruction was not random. It was organized, scheduled, budgeted, and in many cases carefully documented. The documentation itself is part of what makes the history so difficult to absorb, because when you read through the actual records of what was done and how it was authorized, the horror does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, in the language of administration. This is a narration about 19 things that were known during the war and suppressed after it, or known and never fully disclosed, or disclosed so gradually and incompletely that the full picture was never assembled in public view. These are not rumors. They are not conspiracy theories drawn from fringe sources. They are findings that emerged from declassified archives, post-war tribunal records, investigative journalism, academic research conducted decades after the conflict ended, and in some cases from the testimony of people who participated directly and chose, late in their lives, to say what they had seen. Each of these 19 realities was, at some point, inconvenient to someone with the power to keep it quiet. Most of them were kept quiet, at least for a time. Some of them are still not part of the standard account. Begin with the basic assumption most people carry about the war. The assumption is that there were two sides, and that the sides were morally distinguishable, and that the outcome of the war confirmed that distinction. That assumption is not entirely wrong, but it is far more complicated than it appears, and the complications do not reduce to simple symmetry. They do not lead to a conclusion that all sides were equally bad, or that the Allied powers were secretly the same as the Axis. What they reveal instead is something harder to process than simple equivalence. What they reveal is that moral collapse does not require ideological evil as a prerequisite. It requires systems. It requires procedures. It requires the slow normalization of decisions that would have been unthinkable before they became routine. The first of these 19 truths concerns what happened to German prisoners of war held by American and British forces in the final months of the conflict and its immediate aftermath. After the German surrender in May of 1945, approximately 12 million German soldiers and civilians were held in what the Allied command officially designated as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war. The distinction was not accidental. It was deliberate. Under the Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war were entitled to specific protections, including adequate food, shelter, and medical care. By reclassifying captured Germans as disarmed enemy forces, Allied commanders placed them outside the legal framework that would have required those protections to be provided. What followed in the camps along the Rhine River and elsewhere was documented later by Canadian journalist James Back in research that drew heavily on American military records. The documentation showed that mortality rates in some of the Rhine Meadow camps reached catastrophic levels. Men were held in open fields with no shelter from weather that included both spring rains and early summer heat. Food rations in some camps were set at levels that produced visible starvation within weeks. Medical care was minimal or absent. The exact number of deaths remains disputed among historians, and Back's highest estimates have been challenged on methodological grounds. But even the more conservative scholarly assessments acknowledge that tens of thousands of German prisoners died in Allied custody under conditions that would have been illegal under the laws of war that the Allies themselves had helped construct. The reclassification was the mechanism. A word change on a form made it legal. That is how the system worked. The second truth concerns what American forces did in the Pacific theater in ways that were reported selectively or not at all to the domestic public. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan that preceded the atomic bomb attacks of August 1945 was conducted with an intensity and a targeting philosophy that, had it been applied by the opposing side, would have been described without hesitation as a war crime. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 civilians in a single night, a casualty figure that exceeded the immediate death tolls of either atomic bomb attack. The raids were conducted using incendiary bombs, specifically designed to ignite the densely packed wooden structures of Japanese cities. The targeting doctrine had shifted from attempting to destroy military and industrial infrastructure to deliberately maximizing civilian casualties and economic disruption through mass fire. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the bombing campaign, understood what he was ordering. He later stated in an interview that if the United States had lost the war, he expected to be tried as a war criminal. He said this without particular emotion. It was a factual assessment of what the campaign had involved. The American public knew in general terms that Japan was being bombed. They did not know the targeting doctrine. They did not know the specific intent to maximize civilian deaths as a strategic objective. The censorship was not total, but it was sufficient to prevent the kind of sustained public debate that might have complicated the war's moral framing. The third truth is about what the Soviet Union did in Poland and the Baltic states between 1939 and 1941. Before the German invasion of the Soviet Union transformed Stalin's government into an Allied power, and thereby made those actions politically inconvenient to discuss. In September of 1939, following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, Soviet forces invaded eastern Poland in coordination with the German invasion from the west. In the months that followed, Soviet security forces conducted a systematic campaign of deportations and executions targeting Polish military officers, police, intellectuals, landowners, and others identified as potential resistance to Soviet control. The most documented of these actions was the Katyn massacre, in which approximately 22,000 Polish officers, police and intellectuals were shot in the forests of Western Russia on direct orders from Stalin and approved by the Soviet Politburo. When German forces discovered the mass graves in 1943, Soviet authorities denied responsibility and claimed the killings had been carried out by the Germans themselves. The Allied governments, including the United States and Britain, were almost certainly aware that the Soviet denial was false. They chose to accept it publicly. The political calculus was straightforward. The Soviet Union was an essential Allied partner against Germany, and contradicting Soviet explanations for the massacre would have created friction that Allied leadership considered unacceptable. The cover was maintained for decades. The Soviet Union finally acknowledged responsibility for the Katyn massacre in 1990. For 47 years, the official Allied position had been ambiguous at best and falsely exculpatory at worst. The fourth truth involves the use of chemical weapons by Japan against Chinese civilian and military populations throughout the war, and the subsequent decision by American authorities to classify much of the evidence and protect the scientists responsible in exchange for access to their research data. Unit 731 is the most well-documented of Japan's biological and chemical warfare programs, but it was not the only one. Japanese forces used mustard gas, phosgene, and other chemical agents in China repeatedly throughout the war, in violation of international conventions that Japan had not formally ratified, but was widely understood to be bound by under customary international law. The attacks were documented by Chinese medical personnel and some foreign observers, but received minimal coverage in Western media. After the war, American occupation authorities made a deliberate decision. The scientists and military officers who had directed the programs, including Shiro Ishii, the commander of Unit 731, were granted immunity from prosecution at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in exchange for providing their research data to American military and scientific authorities. The data in question had been generated through experiments on human subjects, including vivisection, exposure to lethal pathogens, frostbite experiments conducted by forcing subjects into freezing water or exposing them to extreme cold, and pressure experiments that documented the effects of rapid atmospheric decompression on the human body. The subjects were predominantly Chinese, Korean, and Soviet prisoners, some of whom had been obtained through direct cooperation with the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police. The American decision to grant immunity was made at the highest levels of the occupation authority and was kept classified for decades. The scientists received new identities or were allowed to return to academic and medical careers in Japan. The data was incorporated into American military research programs. The victims received no acknowledgement. The decision was presented, to the extent it was discussed at all, as a necessary compromise in the early Cold War context. The fact that it involved the deliberate suppression of evidence of crimes against humanity at a tribunal specifically created to prosecute crimes against humanity was noted by almost no one in positions of public authority at the time. The fifth truth is about the deliberate Allied policy of destroying German civilian infrastructure and housing through bombing, and the explicit internal acknowledgement that the purpose of this destruction was not primarily military. The strategic bombing offensive against Germany conducted by the British Royal Air Force under Arthur Harris and the American Army Air Forces under various commanders targeted German cities with objectives that shifted over the course of the war from precision military targeting to what was called area bombing, a term that in practice meant the systematic destruction of urban residential areas and the populations within them. The stated military rationale was that destroying worker housing and urban infrastructure would degrade industrial production and undermine civilian morale sufficiently to reduce Germany's capacity to wage war. The internal debates within Allied command, some of which have been declassified, show that there was significant awareness that the civilian casualty rates produced by area bombing were high and that the actual impact on German industrial production was often modest relative to the cost. Assessments conducted during and after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey found that German industrial production actually increased in many sectors through 1944 despite sustained bombing, in part because German workers and industrial managers adapted to the damage with considerable efficiency. The bombing killed an estimated 300,000 to 600,000 German civilians, figures that vary depending on methodology, and wounded approximately 800,000 more. The city of Dresden was attacked in February of 1945, when the military situation had already made German defeat effectively certain, and the resulting firestorm killed somewhere between 25,000 and 100,000 people, the exact figure remaining contested. The bombing continued on a schedule that had been established months earlier, processing targets according to plans that outlasted the strategic rationale that had produced them. The sixth truth concerns the experience of Black American soldiers who served in a segregated military fighting a war described explicitly as a struggle for democracy and human freedom, and what happened to them when they returned home. This is perhaps the least hidden of the 19 truths discussed here, but its full weight has never been fully absorbed into the standard account of what the war meant. Approximately 1 million Black Americans served in the armed forces during World War II. They served in segregated units, were systematically denied promotion to command positions, were assigned disproportionately to labor and service roles rather than combat commands, and encountered formal racial discrimination enforced not by rogue individuals, but by official military policy. The Red Cross maintained separate blood banks for white and black donors during the war, a policy that had no medical justification and was maintained explicitly to accommodate the racial beliefs of white soldiers and officers. The blood had been separated at the insistence of military authorities. It was policy. When black veterans returned home, they returned to a country in which the GI Bill's substantial benefits were administered in ways that routinely excluded them. Loans were denied. Educational opportunities were blocked. Veterans programs were run at the local level in much of the South in ways that systematically directed benefits away from black applicants. The violence against returning black veterans was documented but rarely prosecuted. Sergeant Isaac Woodard was blinded by a South Carolina police chief within hours of being honorably discharged from the Army in 1946. The officer was acquitted by an all-white jury after a brief deliberation. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and it was allowed to function by the same governmental apparatus that had sent black men to fight for freedom abroad. The seventh truth involves what American and British intelligence knew about the German extermination program against European Jews, and when they knew it, and what they chose not to do with that information. This is a history that has been extensively researched and documented, and the conclusions are not in serious dispute among historians, even though the full implications have never been openly acknowledged by the governments involved. By 1942, both the American Office of Strategic Services and British Intelligence Services had received detailed reports about the mass killings at sites in Poland and elsewhere. The reports came from multiple sources, including escaped prisoners, members of the Polish underground, diplomatic channels, and intercepted German communications. The decision-making that followed has been documented in records that were declassified beginning in the 1970s and continuing into the 1990s. Proposals to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz were raised and rejected. The arguments against bombing varied, but the consistent thread was that the diversion of bombers from industrial and military targets was not justifiable, a calculation that was made while those same bombers were being directed to attack German cities for purposes of civilian morale degradation. The British Foreign Office and American State Department both maintained restrictive immigration policies that limited the number of Jewish refugees who could enter their countries, policies that remained in effect during the period when the extermination camps were operating. The decisions were made by people who had documentation. The documentation was reviewed. The decision was to proceed as before. The eighth truth concerns the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens and others after the war under Operation Keelhaul, an Allied program that returned approximately 2 million people to the Soviet Union against their will, many of whom were subsequently executed or sent to the Gulag. The program operated under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, in which Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had agreed that Soviet citizens liberated by Western Allied forces would be returned to Soviet custody. The agreement did not contemplate what would happen to those individuals once returned. What happened was extensively documented by observers and participants who found the process deeply troubling even at the time. The forced repatriations included people who had collaborated with Germany, but also included vast numbers of Soviet citizens who had simply been captured by German forces, forced laborers who had been taken to Germany against their will, and in some cases people who had been born outside the Soviet Union and had never been Soviet citizens at all. The operations sometimes required British and American soldiers to use force against people who resisted boarding the trains and ships that would take them east. There are documented accounts of people attempting suicide rather than be returned. The operations were conducted according to schedule. The paperwork was filed. The trains departed. The subsequent fate of most of those returned was not investigated by Western authorities, and the program itself was classified and remained largely unknown to the public for decades. The ninth truth is about what Japan's military government did in the occupied Philippines and what happened to the historical accounting afterward. The Manila Massacre of February 1945 was a 3-week campaign during which Japanese forces, facing certain defeat as American troops closed in on the Philippine capital, killed an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians. The killing was not incidental. It was deliberate and systematic, carried out with organizational structure by units operating under command authority. Civilians were herded into buildings and killed. Women were raped and killed. Children were killed. The details were documented in testimony collected after the war by American military authorities and by Filipino survivors. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines, was tried by a military tribunal and executed for failing to prevent the massacre, even though evidence presented at the trial suggested that the Manila killings had been ordered by the Naval Command rather than by Yamashita himself, and that he had not known about them in time to stop them. The tribunal was conducted under procedural rules that denied the defense adequate time to prepare, limited the admissibility of exculpatory evidence, and operated under intense political pressure to produce a conviction quickly. Justice Rutledge of the United States Supreme Court dissented from the court's decision not to review the case, describing the proceedings as a departure from the standards of justice that the United States claimed to represent. The execution proceeded on schedule. The 10th truth involves what American forces did on Okinawa during the spring of 1945, and the extent to which civilian deaths were treated as an acceptable operational cost. The Battle of Okinawa was one of the most violent engagements of the Pacific War. American forces landed in April of 1945 and fought for roughly 82 days against Japanese defenders who had prepared extensive defensive positions in the island's terrain. The civilian population of Okinawa, which was approximately 300,000 people, was caught in the middle of this. The Japanese military had incorporated civilians into defensive plans, sometimes arming them or ordering them to attack American forces. American commanders operated under orders and assumptions that treated the distinction between civilian and combatant as unreliable. Approximately 100,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle, a figure that represents roughly 1/3 of the island's pre-war civilian population. Some were killed by Japanese soldiers who enforced suicidal last stands or who killed civilians to prevent them from surrendering. Many were killed in the crossfire of the ground combat. Some were killed by American bombardment, which was conducted with massive firepower against populated terrain with limited ability to distinguish between military and civilian targets. The operation was planned and executed according to military doctrine that accepted high civilian casualties as a consequence of the strategic objective. The planners understood what the casualty projections looked like. The operation proceeded on the projected timeline. The 11th truth concerns the treatment of Italian Americans and Japanese Americans on the American home front, but focuses specifically on something that received even less public attention than the Japanese American internment: the deportation of Italian nationals and the travel restrictions placed on Italian American citizens, including many who had lived in the United States for decades. The internment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans in concentration camps following the attack on Pearl Harbor has been acknowledged in official American history, with the United States government issuing a formal apology and reparations in 1988. The parallel restrictions placed on Italian Americans and German Americans received no such acknowledgement. Under the Enemy Alien Control Program, administered by the Department of Justice, Italian nationals in the United States were classified as enemy aliens and subjected to curfews, travel restrictions, and prohibitions on owning cameras and shortwave radios. Approximately 10,000 Italian nationals were forcibly relocated from designated military zones, including the California coast. Hundreds were interned in camps. The program affected people who had lived in the United States for 20, 30, or 40 years, who had American citizen children, and who had no demonstrated connection to fascist ideology or the Italian war effort. The program was operated by a legal framework that had been put in place specifically for this purpose, moving through channels, generating paperwork, producing outcomes that were orderly and documented, and allowed to fade from public memory because they did not fit the narrative of the war as a conflict fought for human freedom. The 12th truth is about the Imperial Japanese Army's use of forced labor across occupied Asia, specifically the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, known informally as the Death Railway, and the conditions under which approximately 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and an estimated 180,000 to 250,000 Asian forced laborers built it. The Allied prisoner experience at the railway has been documented in post-war memoirs and films, and has entered the historical record with reasonable completeness. The Asian forced laborer experience has not. The laborers, primarily Tamils, Malays, Burmese and Javanese, were recruited through a system that combined deception, coercion and outright kidnapping. They were told they would receive wages and decent working conditions. What they received was plantation-style forced labor under conditions of severe food deprivation, inadequate shelter, and exposure to tropical disease with minimal medical care. Mortality estimates for Asian laborers on the railway range from 80,000 to 100,000 dead, which represents somewhere between 40 and 50% of the total Asian workforce employed on the project. The disparity in historical attention between Allied POW deaths and Asian laborer deaths reflects the racial hierarchy that operated within the Allied discourse about the war's victims. The post-war tribunals prosecuted Japanese officers for the treatment of Allied prisoners. The deaths of Asian laborers received less systematic legal attention. The 13th truth involves what American pharmaceutical and chemical companies knew about the conditions in German forced labor programs and the extent to which some American-linked corporations continued doing business with entities that used forced labor during the war. This is a history that has been researched most completely in the context of the post-war denazification and reparations processes, and the findings are specific enough to be uncomfortable. IG Farben, the German chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate, operated a synthetic rubber plant called Buna Werke, adjacent to the Auschwitz concentration camp complex, specifically to use prisoner labor from the camp. The plant was built with investment and technical cooperation from American corporate partners including Standard Oil of New Jersey, which had pre-war cartel agreements with IG Farben covering patents and production processes. The corporate relationships had been established before the war and were governed by legal agreements that remained nominally in force until American entry into the conflict made them legally problematic. The extent to which American executives knew specifically about forced labor operations at facilities connected through their corporate partners is a matter of historical debate. But the general structure of the relationships was known to American intelligence and to the legal teams that prepared the post-war IG Farben trial, which was one of the Nuremberg successor trials. 24 IG Farben executives were convicted of charges including slavery and mass murder. The maximum sentence imposed was 8 years. Most were released within 3 years of sentencing. Several subsequently held senior positions in the post-war German chemical and pharmaceutical industry, which reconstituted itself with considerable speed after the war ended. The 14th truth concerns what happened in the American occupation zone in Germany in the immediate post-war period, specifically the scale of rape committed by American soldiers against German women and the near-complete institutional suppression of this information. This is a history that has been examined most carefully by historian Robert Lilly in research published in the early 2000s based on American military court-martial records. The records, which had been held in archives for decades, documented that American soldiers committed an estimated 14,000 rapes of German women in the occupation zone between 1945 and 1955. The records also documented how the cases were handled institutionally. Court-martial convictions for rape were achieved, but the punishment was inconsistent in ways that tracked with the racial demographics of the accused. Black American soldiers convicted of rape were disproportionately sentenced to death or long imprisonment compared to white soldiers convicted of the same offense under similar circumstances. The disparity was documented in the court-martial records themselves. The overall picture that emerged from the records was of a military justice system that prosecuted some offenses while systematically managing the public presentation of the overall pattern. Reports of rape were suppressed in the American military press. The German civilian press was under occupation censorship. The information existed in the official records and did not enter public awareness because those records were not accessible and because no institutional interest was served by making them accessible. The 15th truth is about the Allied bombing of neutral countries and the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure outside the declared war zones in ways that were covered by wartime censorship. Switzerland was bombed by American aircraft on multiple occasions, with the most significant incident occurring in April of 1944 when American bombers attacked the Swiss city of Schaffhausen, killing 40 civilians and injuring many others. The bombing was officially attributed to navigation error, and American authorities issued an apology and paid compensation. The internal records of the incident, examined by researchers after declassification, suggested a more complicated picture, in which the navigation error explanation was at minimum incomplete. Sweden, also nominally neutral, was overflown repeatedly by aircraft from both sides and was subjected to pressure from both the Allies and Germany to limit its economic relationships with the opposing side. Sweden supplied iron ore to Germany throughout the war on terms that were essential to German steel production. The Allies were aware of this and exerted pressure through diplomatic and economic channels. The Swedish government navigated these pressures by making calibrated concessions to each side while maintaining formal neutrality, a position that allowed Swedish society to emerge from the war with its infrastructure and economy intact, while neighboring countries were being destroyed. The moral dimension of this calculated neutrality was not a subject that Allied propaganda was interested in exploring. The 16th truth involves what happened to the Japanese American men who were drafted into the American military from inside the internment camps, and what that conscription revealed about the institutional logic of the internment itself. Beginning in 1944, the United States government began drafting Japanese American men directly from the relocation centers where their families were being held as enemy aliens. The draft applied to men who'd been removed from their homes and communities by government order, whose property had in many cases been seized or lost, and whose families remained confined behind fences guarded by American soldiers. Some men refused the draft in protest of the conditions under which it was being imposed. Approximately 300 refused induction and were subsequently prosecuted for draft evasion. They were convicted and imprisoned. The prosecutions were conducted through normal legal channels, with normal procedural regularity, generating normal records of conviction and sentencing. The government's position was that the obligation to serve in the military applied regardless of the treatment the draftees' families were receiving. The legal argument was internally coherent within its own framework. The framework happened to require the simultaneous maintenance of two propositions that were in fundamental tension with each other: that Japanese Americans were dangerous enough to require mass incarceration as a security measure, and that Japanese American men were reliable enough to be trusted with military weapons and duties. Both propositions were maintained simultaneously by the same government in the same period. The 17th truth concerns what American and British intelligence services knew about the Holocaust from signals intelligence, specifically from the decryption of German police and SS communications that described mass killings in Eastern Europe, and when this information was received and what was done with it. The British signals intelligence operation at Bletchley Park had broken multiple German communication codes by 1941 and was intercepting and decrypting a range of German military and police traffic. Among the traffic intercepted in 1941 were reports from German police battalions and SS units operating in the Soviet Union, describing the systematic killing of Jewish populations in towns and villages across the occupied Eastern territories. The reports were detailed. They included numbers of people killed, locations, and dates. The intercepts were reviewed by British intelligence analysts and in some cases passed to senior officials. There is documented evidence that Winston Churchill was aware of the general content of these intercepts by mid-1941. The question of what was done with this information, and specifically why it was not used to give earlier or more forceful public warning of the scale of what was happening, has been examined by multiple historians. The answers that emerge from the documentary record are not satisfying. The intelligence had operational value that would have been compromised by public disclosure. The political sensitivity of the information in the context of Soviet-Allied relations, given that the killings were occurring in Soviet territory, created additional complications. The administrative habit of treating intelligence as a commodity to be managed rather than a moral emergency to be addressed appears to have governed the handling of the information at every level. The 18th truth is about what the United States government did with German scientists after the war under Operation Paperclip, and the specific, documented process by which security evaluations were falsified to allow scientists with documented participation in war crimes to enter the country and work for American military and scientific programs. The broad outlines of Operation Paperclip are now part of the historical record. Approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States after the war to work on military research programs. The program has been discussed in books, documentaries, and academic papers. What has been less consistently foregrounded is the specific mechanism by which it operated. Many of the scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip had been members of the Nazi Party, the SS, or both. American law prohibited the immigration of people with such affiliations. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which ran the program, developed a practice of preparing sanitized biographies of the scientists that omitted or minimized their Nazi Party membership and wartime activities. The State Department and the Justice Department's immigration enforcement functions were presented with documentation that had been altered to remove disqualifying information. The process was deliberate and systematic. It was not a matter of individual officers making individual decisions to look the other way. It was an institutional practice that moved through channels, generated its own paperwork, and produced outcomes that were then incorporated into official records as though they reflected genuine security clearance processes. Werner von Braun, who became the most publicly celebrated of the paperclip scientists and whose work on American rocket programs and the NASA space effort made him a figure of national admiration, had been a member of the Nazi Party and an officer in the SS. He had directly overseen the production of V-2 rockets at an underground factory called Mittelwerk, which was staffed by concentration camp prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau camp. The conditions at Mittelwerk were lethal. An estimated 12,000 prisoners died there, a death toll that exceeded the number of people killed by the V-2 rockets themselves in combat. Von Braun was aware of the conditions at the facility he supervised. This information was known to American intelligence before the decision to recruit him was made. The recruitment proceeded. The 19th truth is perhaps the most structural of all, and it is about the legal and institutional framework that governed the post-war settlements. Specifically the way in which the Nuremberg tribunals defined and prosecuted crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in ways that were carefully calibrated to apply to the defeated powers while excluding the conduct of the victorious ones. The Nuremberg trials have an important historical status as the first systematic international prosecution of leaders for crimes committed in the conduct of war and the operation of government. The principle that individuals could be held criminally accountable for state-directed atrocities was genuine and consequential. The application of that principle was selective in ways that the tribunal's own participants sometimes acknowledged. The charge of waging aggressive war, which was the most significant charge brought against the major German defendants, was applied to the German invasion of Poland in September 1939. It was not applied to the Soviet invasion of Poland that occurred simultaneously under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Soviet Union was a co-prosecutor at Nuremberg. The charge of crimes against humanity, applied to German conduct towards civilian populations, was not extended to Allied conduct that fell within the same definitional framework. The strategic bombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities were not indicted. The forced repatriations were not indicted. The operation of the prisoner of war reclassification system was not indicted. The tribunal operated under a legal framework that had been constructed by the victors specifically for this proceeding. The German Defense Counsel attempted to raise the tu quoque argument, the argument that the defendants could not be convicted under a standard that the prosecuting parties had themselves violated, and the tribunal ruled the argument inadmissible. The ruling had a certain internal legal logic, in that allowing each defendant to raise the conduct of other parties would have made prosecution procedurally impossible. But the ruling also ensured that the proceedings would produce a historical record that was defined by what the tribunal chose to examine and silent about what it chose not to examine. The resulting record was real. The convictions were based on genuine evidence of genuine crimes. The findings about German planning and execution of mass murder were accurate and important, but the record was also partial in a specific and consequential way. It established a legal and historical framework in which the war's meaning was defined by the crimes of those who lost it. The crimes of those who won it were placed outside the frame. That framework did not collapse after the war ended. It became the foundation of the post-war international legal order. The institutions built on that foundation, the United Nations, the Geneva Convention system, the structure of international humanitarian law, were genuine achievements with genuine value, and they were built on a record that had been carefully managed to exclude the evidence that would have complicated the construction. The war ended. The killing stopped. The paperwork was filed. The records that needed to remain accessible remained accessible, and the records that needed to remain closed remained closed. And the institutions continued processing decisions in the same manner that institutions process decisions, one form at a time, one approval at a time, one reclassification at a time, and the people who had done the work returned to their offices and their careers and their countries, and the systems that had made the work possible did not dissolve with the peace but persisted in altered form under new names for new purposes, with the same fundamental architecture intact.